Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to East Central Missouri and the world, and welcome to the James Strong Show podcast number 347. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for making us a part of your day. I appreciate it. This podcast was recorded on the afternoon of Saturday, January the 20th, from the James Strong studio in Western St. Charles County. Sorry, my voice cracked. Perhaps I'm going through puberty or not. The podcast today, the essay today, America's Misconception of Happiness. There was an article I stumbled upon this week out of Newsweek magazine. I guess they still call it Newsweek magazine. I don't think there's a hard copy magazine, but it's an e-copy and you can read articles off it. And you know what? Sometimes it's pretty good. There's interesting stuff on there. It's not unlike the old Newsweek and Time magazine of yesteryear, but of course there's not a paper copy anymore. But and it was an interesting article, I thought, and it made me think. And it made me think a whole lot. And it had to do with the topic. Actually, the headline is America's Suffering at a Rate Rarely Reached. Well, that caught my interest. We'll talk about that. First of all, I do want to talk just a little bit about a couple things that happened today and happened last week that were interesting, thought-provoking, and really worth discussion, worth discussion, whatever. Either way, Saturday is normally my day to work on the old Jaguar. Okay, usually with Dad, but not always. I got up this morning and it was 3 degrees. I thought, ooh, maybe it's going to warm up. So about an hour later, it was 0 degrees. So I thought, you know what? It's not going to warm up. The high was supposed to be 10. Okay. So if it was going to warm up to a balmy 10, I thought, you know what? I'm not doing this today. But I need to get it done because I didn't work on it last weekend. I won't be working on it next weekend because I'll be out of the country in warm and sunny Puerto Rico. So I need to work on it this weekend. So how do we do this? Okay. You make adjustments, okay? So I swapped Saturday with Sunday. All the stuff I had planned on doing on Sunday, I'm doing today. The podcast, the gym, a few other things, okay? All the things I had planned on doing on Sunday, I'm doing today. And all the things I planned on doing on Saturday, I'm doing on Sunday, okay? So I will be working on the Jaguar tomorrow when the high is supposed to be 31 degrees. 31 is 21 degrees better than 10, okay? So when things happen, you can make an adjustment to make things better. Now, 31 is not sunny and 70, okay? So it's not like I've made things perfect. But with a few minor adjustments, with some massaging, with some swapping about, you can make things better. More on that as we get into the topic, the essay of the podcast. The second thing I wanted to mention is actually something that happened last week, and I was going to mention on the podcast last Saturday, but I didn't, and I'm not sure why, but I didn't. Maybe I just forgot, didn't write it down. I mean, that's kind of my MO. I have a bad memory. And in fact, my dad even said, son, your memory's getting terrible. I said, nope, it's not. He said, well, yeah, you didn't remember this. You didn't remember that. I said, Dad, my memory has always been terrible. If I don't write it down or make a note of it, quite often I just forget. So it's not that I'm becoming old and senile. It's just that I was always this way and you're just now noticing it. And that's the fact. Okay. So I didn't write this down. And, so I'm mentioning it this week instead of last week. But you know how I don't like the conspiracy theorists who say, the country's going to be in civil war within 6 months. Stop it. We need to take our country back. Stop it. Nobody's taking your country, okay? However, there's a reason people say this kind of stuff, okay? And while I don't agree with any of those statements, where there's smoke, there's fire. I have to keep a close eye on my passport because I have to have my passport in order to work. I do go out of the country occasionally, actually quite often, mainly to Canada and Mexico. While that's not far, it's out of the country. You've got to have a passport to get in and out, okay? And if I'm going further, there are bigger restrictions. Sometimes you need a visa. Sometimes you need a passport to be valid for 6 months. Sometimes you need a passport to be valid for 1 year. In other words, if it expires in 4 months, you can't come into the country because their rule is it's got to have at least 6 months of good datage on there. Is that a word? Did I just make it up? It's got to be good for 6 months, okay? So I went to Mexico last week. I will be going to Canada probably in March. Both of those countries require you to have a passport, but they just have to be valid. They don't have to be valid for 6 months. However, as soon as I get back from the Canada trip, I need to get a new passport because if I need to go to Europe or Asia, you've got to have a passport that's valid for 6 months. My passport runs out in August, so we will be about to that time. So I have to plan everything because I need a valid passport. Now, to make a short story very long, here's what happened at the border. The people this was coming, we just crossed the border, the footbridge border, from Canada, from the United States to Mexico, okay? Getting into Mexico, you can just walk across the border. There's really no immigration to go through. However, we did have to go through immigration because we are visiting businesses. And if you're a tourist going into Mexico, no big deal. If you're a vendor or salesperson going into Mexico doing business someplace, still not a big deal, but they want to know who you saw, how long you're going to be there, what companies you are, how you're getting about. They just want to know, okay? There's no fees, there's no tariffs, there's nothing like that, but there's paperwork that you have to file with the company that you're going to and to keep a copy for yourself. It's just the Mexican government's checks and balances, okay? On the way back, there's nothing like that in the United States, but you do need to show a valid passport to get back into the country, okay? And again, if you're going from Mexico to the U.S., it just needs to be a valid passport. If you're going across the border on July 20th and your passport expires on July 21st, you're still good, okay? The person in front of me, young Hispanic lady, girl, lady, very young lady, okay? I assume she was Mexican because we were at the Mexican border. And while I wasn't real close to her because there's a bit of a gap they make you keep just for safety and privacy reasons, but I could still understand, I could still hear the whole conversation. The lady gave the passport to the agent, the Border Patrol agent. He looked at it. He looked at the lady and said, "You do know this passport expired 5 years ago, don't you?" And she said yes. And he let her go. She walked right into the country without a valid passport. So when stuff like that happens, okay, and this is, again, please remember, dear listeners, I'm not lying to you. This is not something I heard a guy tell. This is not something I read on the internet. This is not something I read off of Donald Trump's website. This is something that I personally witnessed firsthand, okay? So you're hearing it, I guess, secondhand. If you trust me as a person, you can trust that this is true. We are letting people in the border without documentation. Now you say, well, yeah, strong. They're letting tens of thousands in every day, just coming right across the border. I've always been one to say, look, we need to let people in, but you need to go across the border the right way. My question is, why would anybody risk life and limb to go across the Rio Grande River and risk drowning? Just walk on through with some type of document and say, yeah, I know this isn't good, but I want to come in anyway. And the Border Patrol is going to let you in, okay? And that was the case with this. I mean, and maybe she was just going in to do shopping or going into work for the day, or I had no idea why she was going across the border. But if she was just some immigrant from El Salvador who wanted to walk across the border, who just picked up some old passport someplace or had an expired passport from somebody, maybe not even her, just kind of looked like her, she walked right through. So the reason I'm saying this is the conspiracy theorists, while I don't buy most of their stuff. Most conspiracy theories have an origin based in truth. And this one is one of them. Okay, on to the essay. America's Misconception of Happiness. I mentioned today, earlier in the podcast, that I saw this article in Newsweek magazine. Still call it Newsweek magazine, even though it's not a hard copy magazine. But I still call it magazine, just like I can still call this dopey podcast I do radio, because we're talking about the medium, not the device. So it's a magazine, being a group of stories that you can scroll through instead of paging through, pick and read and learn and be entertained. Okay. And the title of this article was America's Suffering in quotes, at rate rarely reached. Okay. And it was, dateline was yesterday. So this is not an old article. Okay. I'm going to read it to you. Okay. So you can get the gist of the story. And it really piqued my interest. The article reads, Americans are suffering at a level that has rarely been seen. That's according to a new survey. The percentage of Americans estimated to be suffering was 4.3% in the fourth quarter of 2023. That's according to the Gallup National Health and Well-Being Index. Now, it was the fifth time in 6 quarters since the second quarter of 2022 that the number of Americans who evaluated their lives poorly topped 4%. A level that has only rarely been reached since 2008. The average rates between 2022 and 2023 both exceeded the levels of suffering measured during the Great Recession. Again, that's according to Gallup. Now, meanwhile, the percentage of Americans who evaluated their lives well enough to be considered thriving was only 52.1% in 2023. Beating only the Great Recession era between 2008 and 2009 by a couple percentage points, by 2 percentage points. It was 50.2% back then. So that's 1.9 percentage points, less than 2 percentage points. And the first 9 months of the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, when it was 50.2% again. Now, between 2015 and 2019, when there was a steady economic growth, and in 2021, when the economy was recovering from the pandemic, more than 55% of Americans said they were thriving. Now, the survey was conducted between November 30th and December 7th, 2023. 6,386 U.S. adults were surveyed. Gallup categorizes Americans as thriving, struggling, or suffering for its life evaluation index based on how they rate their current and future lives on a ladder scale, with the steps numbered from 0 to 10 using the Cantrell self-anchoring striving scale, whatever that is. Now, those who rate their current life as a 7 or higher and their anticipated life in 5 years as an 8 or higher are classified as thriving, while those who give their current life as well as their next 5 years a 4 or below are classified as suffering. Now, these respondents were more likely to report lacking food and shelter, more likely to have physical pain, stress, worry, sadness, and anger. Now, Gallup reports that the thriving rate among Republicans and independents had declined in the first half of 2021 by 9 percentage points, and Republicans alone by 2.6%. I'm sorry, Republicans 9%, independents 2.6%. However, the thriving rate among Democrats has remained steady. Now, Democrats also had the highest thriving rate in 2023, 55.7%, compared to both Republicans, 51.7%, and independents, 48.4%. Now, rates of thriving and suffering often rise and fall in response to economic, political, and social events like the pandemic, war, economic recessions, political regime changes. Okay, that's according to Aaron Pallas. He's a professor of sociology at the Teachers College at Columbia University. He reported this to Newsweek. Now, it's hard to pinpoint precisely why Americans are more pessimistic about their lives in the past year and why in the past 15 years, but it is worrisome. Candidates for public office often ask the public, are you doing better now than you were a few years back? And if people vote based on their feelings, it may be harder for incumbents to stay in office. And that's a story by in Newsweek magazine, actually written by, let me give, her name is Kadelia Rahman. She's a senior news reporter for Newsweek. And it caused me to scratch my head, okay? Because just the term suffering, okay? And the things that they rate suffering being, okay? And they listed them. Let me scroll down to see what those were again. Pandemic, I get that. Wars. We don't have a war in this country. Yeah, we're fighting proxy wars elsewhere, but there is no war being fought on American soil. Economic recessions, haven't been in one for a long time. Or political regime changes. Now, I don't think they're talking about the Democrat beat the Republican. I think they're talking about coup d'etats. Friends, we don't have coup d'etats in this country, okay? Nobody in this country is starving to death, okay? The poor in this country, or many of the poor in this country, are morbidly obese. They're not hungry. Now, do some not have as good access to quality food as others? Yes, that's a fact. But nobody in this country is starving to death, okay? So the problems we have in this country, I think, are kind of perceived problems. However, perception is everything, okay? And we can point to politicians because, in my opinion, I've said this before, the political atmosphere in this country is just horrible. I'm thinking, okay, you don't like the guy in office, so let's vote somebody else in. Okay. Who? We voted in Donald Trump, didn't like him. Voted in Joe Biden, didn't like him. And who's probably going to be the candidates in the next election? Joe Biden and Donald Trump. Two octogenarians who nobody likes. Those are our candidates. Really, that's the best we can do? Well, if there were better, the people would prop them up because the people do speak. The people do get their way eventually. It always happens, okay? But the political atmosphere in this country is horrible. But is that really a reason to say that I'm suffering because your dopey candidate isn't winning an election? Suffering, really? I read an article. In fact, somebody sent this to me, and it had to do, and I think it was kind of to be a poke at Joe Biden, and it had to do with I believe it was the jobless rates, and the jobless rates were one figure, and then the revised figure a month and 3 months later always seemed to be better, or always seemed to be worse, I should say. So it's almost like they're painting the politician who's in office, putting these figures forward, or just making the numbers up, or at least putting their thumb on the scale. But I answered this person. I said, you know what? It doesn't matter if the president is Biden, Trump, Obama, Bush. Go back as far as you want. They've all done that. They always do that. And the media rarely says, hey, look, I know the figure was 12, which is horrible, but the figure that was revised 3 months later is actually 9, which is pretty good. You never hear that story. But for years, I've gone back and checked the rates later, and they're always revised worse. So the politicians paint a Pollyanna picture. But they all do that. The reason I mention that is, are politicians really a reason to say that you're suffering? Truly suffering. I'm currently reading a book about George Washington and Benjamin Franklin and how they with the Continental Congress formed the Constitution of this country. And it was difficult. I mean, when America first became an independent country, when they finally signed the armistice with Great Britain, every state printed their own money. The soldiers didn't get paid. Nobody was going to pay the soldiers. They were talking about taking up arms against the government to get their money. No country would recognize the United States because there were 13 different states, so they had to do something to make this thing right. And the Constitution they came up with has so many checks and balances where even the most powerful man in the country, or woman, person, the president, doesn't have a ton of power. I mean, you've got all three branches of government, the executive, legislative, and judicial. And there's checks and balances, and it works. I guess I would say that if you are really suffering because of the politicians in charge, friend, you need to look at other stuff, okay? Because you can get around that so easily. Money problems, I kind of get it, okay? But money problems to me, some people do have money problems. It just happens. People get sick. People lose jobs. Things happen, okay? I get that. But if you plan properly and if you're healthy, you can get around most any money problem. I've told this story before, and I'm going to tell it again. And it was the story of a lady that I worked with. And she came to me one day. This was years ago. And she said, look, I know you're good with money. I'm not. I'm having big problems. I don't make enough money. I'm in the red. I need some help. Can you help me out? Can you give me some advice? I said, sure, let's sit down. So we sat down. We started talking about things. I said, okay, how much in the hole are you? And it wasn't much, okay? She was like a couple $100 in the red every month. Okay, well, let's turn this thing around. So I started talking about things. I said, okay, what about your house payment? Well, I got to live someplace. Yeah, you're right. You do. You have to live someplace. So scratch that. I said, you smoke, right? Yeah, I do. How much? She told me. I said, okay, let's scratch that. Quit smoking. The next thing, I said, how much do you spend in gasoline? She said, well, I spend about this much in gasoline every month. I said, well, cut back on your trip. She said, I really don't go anywhere but to and from work. I said, but you go home from lunch every day, right? She said, yes. I said, well, don't do that anymore. If you mainly just drive to and from work every day and you're doing it twice a day, just do it once a day so you'll cut your gas bill in half. You'll save this. Okay, let's talk about other things. Do you have cable TV at home? Yes. How much is it? $150 a month. I said, cancel it. You don't have to have cable TV. You can have somebody rig an antenna in your attic or on the roof of your house. You can get regular TV. So scratch the cable TV. I said, what other expenses do you have that are high? She said, well, my gardener. I said, what do you mean your gardener? She said, well, I have a guy come by and cut the grass. I said, don't you have a teenage son at home? She said, yeah. I said, well, have him cut the grass. I said, look, let's do these four things. I did the math. I said, you will go from $200 in the hole to about $300 in the black if you quit smoking, cancel your cable, have your son cut your grass, and don't go home for lunch. She teared up as she said, I can't possibly do any of those things, and walked away. Now, that lady was suffering, but she asked me for a solution. I provided a solution that did not include moving out of her home or selling her car or selling a kidney or cutting back on her food. It meant don't smoke, cancel TV, don't go home from lunch, and ask your teenage son to cut the grass instead of having the gardener do it. And you're there. And she couldn't do it. That, my friends, is what most people say are my money problems. Okay. This survey, this study says that Republicans' perception is worse. And while I've always considered myself a Democrat, for the most part, I've always tended to vote Republican. And it's not because I consider myself a Republican, because I do not. I consider myself an independent. However, normally, under most circumstances, the Republican, not always, but the Republican candidate reflects my thoughts more than the Democratic candidate. And while the Democratic candidates have not gotten any better, the Republican candidates, in many respects, have just become horrible, just awful. Okay. So I understand why Republicans' perception can be worse, because they don't have anybody that can lead. And I can understand why the Democrats' perception can be better, because while they're led by fools as well, it's the same group of fools they've always had. So nothing's changed, okay? But again, this is politics. You can get past that stuff. I've always told myself, and I've advised people, you can just prosper in spite of what these dopes in Washington, or in Missouri's case, Jefferson City, do. Okay, what they do, if you do play your cards right, the effect they have on you is a rounding error. Okay, we still live in a capitalist society where you can do many things very well. Okay. And again, there's a lot of people with a lot of problems. Okay. I'm not going to say there's nobody out there suffering, because there are. But most problems in life, and if you've listened to this show for any length of time, and I've been doing it, whether it's radio or television, for about 20 years now, okay? All solutions to all problems are simple. Implementation, however, is not always easy, okay? If you have money problems, make more money or spend less, or a combination of the two. I mentioned I would love to have been, installing the electrical wiring harness on the old Jaguar today, but it was 0 degrees. I'm not doing that. I hate cold weather. And if you hate cold weather, then move or buy a parka. Or next week I'll be in Puerto Rico. Okay. So that's going to be something. I understand everybody can't do that, but everybody can buy a parka. I still go on my daily walk at lunchtime. At lunchtime, if I'm in town, we get an hour for lunch. So I go on a 3-mile walk. In this type of weather, it was horrible with the weather being cold like it is. I bought a parka last year. In fact, it was a Land's End parka on half-price clearance at Kohl's, okay? And what sold me on this parka is there was a sign on it. Land's End is a good brand. They make good stuff. And the tag on this parka said, "This is the warmest coat that we offer." Sold. If it's 0 degrees, just there's not much wind, I'm warm in that parka, so I can go on my 3-mile walk. Now, that doesn't, does that mean that, well, that's just as good as 70-degree weather? No, but you've made an adjustment and you've made do. Okay. If you work too far away from home, like I used to live an hour away from where I worked. I moved closer. Okay. Then work closer to home. That means either you move closer to your job or you get a job that's closer. That's what I did. Another story. And this was a guy who was complaining about the high price of gasoline. This was back a couple 3 years ago when gasoline was $4 a gallon, okay? And this was a real hardship for this guy, because this guy lived some 60 miles from work. And he drove a truck that got about 8 miles to the gallon. And he said, "Man, everything I'm earning is going towards gasoline." I said, "Well, then move closer." He said, "But no, this is where I live. This is where I want to live. This is my home. I can't move closer." I said, "Well, then, we like you here, but get a job closer to home." "Nah, there's no jobs out where I live." "Okay, well then buy a vehicle that gets 38 miles to the gallon instead of 8 miles to the gallon." He said, "I can't do that. That's my truck. I got to have a truck." I said, "Why? To go to and from work?" He says, "No, I've always driven a truck. I got to have a truck." That guy wanted to do zero to solve his problem. Okay. He wanted the solution to be gasoline needs to be $1.50 a gallon, not $4 a gallon. Okay. And then blame that on the president. Okay. First of all, the president has, I'm not going to say zero, but very little to do with the price of gasoline. OPEC has more to do with the price of gasoline than anybody. Okay. But if your commute's too far, move closer or work closer or get a vehicle that gets better gas mileage. Okay. It's easy. It's easy. I should say it's simple. The implementation may not be easy because you'll have to get out of your comfort zone. Okay. In other words, if you don't like your life, friends, just change it. That's the good thing about this country or anywhere in the West. Just change things. If there's something about your life you don't like, change it. Now, I know there's certain things you can't do. I mean, if you say, you know what, I was in the Gulf War and I lost both my legs. Okay, well, you can't get new legs, okay? But you can make do. And most people, if they'll look at things honestly, they can change their life. It's not to say you can make it perfect. It's not to say you can solve all your problems, but you can strive to work towards something that's better. And really, if you're honest, nobody lives in nirvana, okay? And with me personally, what always seems to do better with me is not when I reach the pinnacle, but it's the route getting there, okay? In other words, if I look back and I think, wow, this month I'm better off than I was last month, it puts a smile on my face, okay? Because if you're a little bit better with the understanding that you're never going to be perfect, then better is an improvement. And that's all you can do. You can't be ridiculous and say, well, my goal in life is to be shortstop for the St. Louis Cardinals. I'm 64. That's not going to happen. It's an unrealistic goal. But if my goal is, you know what? I want to get a little bit more limber and I want to play shortstop for an over 60 league. I can do that. I certainly can do that. Okay. So you can do stuff. Our diets are horrible. In fact, I will say just me personally, I'll give you another personal aspect of where I was 6 months ago. My blood pressure was kind of high. I had troubles, but if I looked at things honestly, I mean, I wasn't eating right and I wasn't exercising enough. And went to my doctor, and the doctor says, well, you need to eat better and exercise better. So, well, doc, I do this, and that. I can't possibly do anything any better. And he looked at me. He said, yeah, you can. You absolutely can. I said, well, I do all this good. I said, he said, yeah, you do. Compared to other people, it's good. But if you want to get from here to there, it needs to be better. So I ramped up the gym routine. I cut out a bunch of crappy stuff in foods for the most part. And guess what? I feel a lot better. I mean, my doctor, he went to school for a long time. And if you pay somebody money to give you advice and then you just don't take it, you've wasted your money and his time and your time. So there's always things you can do in your life to change it. If you're not healthy, get better. If you're sick, get better. And I don't mean, again, sometimes you've hit that point of no return, but you can do things to improve yourself to get yourself better. We live in the West, folks, and living in the West has its own set of problems, unique problems. And I had a conversation with a friend who lives in a third world country, and he asked me the question, well, you know, in the U.S., he said, you guys have so much, and we do. He said, I don't know why it costs so much money. Things are so expensive in the West. I said, well, things are so expensive, but then we also have to earn more money. Because if we live in a house in the Midwest, we've got to have air conditioning. Now, we don't have to, but we really do. Okay, that's just part of what we have. And air conditioning is expensive. So you have to earn so much money if you want to live in a house with air conditioning. Now, if you live in the Philippines, maybe you don't need air conditioning, okay? But living in the West means you've got to have certain things that living in a developing country you don't need, okay? So living in the West does have its advantages but disadvantages, or disadvantages but advantages, both ways. I've told the story before. I work the day job in manufacturing, and some of my customers are customers who manufacture baby diapers, adult incontinence products, feminine care products, and wet wipes, okay? And most of these factories, most of these plants are located in areas that are away from big cities. The exception is Miami, Florida. Now, I think one of these plants is closed down, but once upon a time, they had 3 plants in California, or no, not California, what am I saying? In Miami, Florida, okay? 3 of them. And I asked him, why do you do this? It's expensive to manufacture in Miami. He said, yeah, it is. But you've got plants in Venezuela, Colombia, other places like that. Why do you have a plant in Miami, Florida? He said, well, we know Miami. It's has a large Latino community. It's easy to get in and out of, easy to fly in and out of from Latin America. And we have to have some type of manufacturing base here. And I asked him why. He said, well, because in our country, it's not a matter of if, but a matter of when there's going to be a coup d'etat. And the government takes over and seizes your assets. Now, generally what happens is the things settle down, the smoke clears, and after a few years, things are fine. But in the meantime, there's chaos. And we've got to find some place to manufacture product. And in the United States, you people don't have a coup d'etats. It doesn't happen here. So yeah, it costs more money, but you don't have those surprises. And don't even say January 6th was an attempted coup, because it was not. January 6th was a bunch of fat dopes on high blood pressure medicine who just thought they were cool, okay? January 6th was not a coup d'etat. It wasn't. But I'm just letting you know that things in this country and the West in general are so good that when I hear things about a record number of Americans are suffering, I don't buy it. I don't buy it at all, because so many of them are like the young lady that I talked to. I'm suffering. I can't see myself getting ahead. But I'm not going to stop smoking. I'm not canceling cable. I'm not stopping going home from lunch. I'm not going to ask my teenage son to cut my grass. So you will not compromise. Once upon a time, I've said this before, I have been blessed beyond my wildest imaginations, okay? That's not to say my life is perfect, because it's not. But I'm still blessed beyond my wildest imaginations. But once upon a time, when the trophy wife didn't work outside the home, and we had 4 children at home, and we lived out here, and we're having trouble making bills. Friends, I worked 2 jobs, and for a while I worked 3 jobs. That was hard. That was real hard. But you know what? I had the opportunity, and I was able to do it. And I didn't do it for a real long time. I just did it to get us through the bumps, through the hard times, to make the bills, to keep your head above water, because you knew eventually the worm was going to turn and you didn't have to do that. And so I went from 3 jobs to 2 jobs, and then eventually to 1 job, because I made enough money at the 1 job, okay? And the trophy wife started working part-time when the kids got older. She started working in teaching school in the evening. So things happen, okay? And in the meantime, you tread water until the situation changes. During none of those times did I ever consider myself as suffering. Because you remember on that index, okay, on a scale of 1 to 10, where are you now? And where do you see yourself in 5 years? And for my entire life, I've always seen myself better off in 5 years than I am now. I still do. And in 5 years, I will not be working my day job. So my income will go from sweet to non-existent. Okay. But again, I've been blessed and we've saved and invested, so we'll be just fine. So it's not always about the money. It's about your lifestyle. It's about your plans. It's about going down the path that you've charted for yourself. If you haven't charted a path, how can you know how you're doing? America's misconception of happiness. With few exceptions. If you're one of these people who say, well, look, I am unhappy. Dear listener, I would just ask that you look at yourself real hard. Look at your life real hard. And you can only compare yourselves to others. And if you look at other people in other countries, compare yourself to them. Do you have enough food? Chances are it's cold outside where you live, but it's warm inside where you are, okay? You're not having trouble paying your heating bill. And if you are, there's philanthropic organizations that can help you out. You've got enough food. You have enough to do everything that you need. Do you have $1 million in the bank? No. Is your life hunky-dory? Maybe not. Are you as healthy as you were 25 years ago? Doubt it. But look at things hard. And before you say, God is dead and the war has begun, really, really evaluate things to see how bad things really are. I think you'll find that you're not suffering, and while things aren't perfect, you can do lots of things to make them better. Well, that's it. We're done. JamesStrongShow@hotmail.com. That's the email address. Send me your emails. I love hearing your emails. I do respond to each and every one of them. That's it. We're done. Until next time, this is James Strong saying adios.